Hello, it's Matthew here from the Nations of Sanity project, a project based on the assertion that crime and law can and should be defined by the concept of individual self-ownership and established as the terms of a peace agreement. And I'm sitting down to have another conversation with Adam Haman from Haman Nature. I'm going to put a link to his channel in the description, which I highly recommend, as well as his links to his articles as well, which he does, which are also well worth a look at. On his channel, you will see a link to a previous conversation we had, as well as many other great conversations. There's also a previous conversation we've had mainly on immigration, I think we discussed on my channel, which I'll also put a link in there. There's also another mystery conversation that got deleted by some moron, but we won't go into that too much. This is the fourth conversation we've had. And although we've touched on different subjects, a lot of it has involved me trying to get scrutiny for the Nations of Sanity project. And Adam's been very generous with his time to kind of lend me some brain power and help me sort of scrutinize these ideas and help us all get to kind of a good way to go forward and a good understanding of the principles that we kind of hold dear. So before I ramble on anymore, I just want to hand it over to Adam to say thank you for once again for taking the time to have this conversation.
Oh, my pleasure, man. Thank you so much for those very kind words. And although my heart will always be broken that you, foolish man, deleted one of the great conversations we've had, I take solace in the fact that somewhere the NSA has scooped that thing up. So it exists somewhere. I mean, there are some positive aspects of having a global surveillance state, and that's one of them. This conversation isn't lost. It's just right next to the Ark of the Covenant that Indiana Jones rescued. It's in another box there, right next door.
Well, if we ever overthrow the criminals who rule us, maybe we'll have a chance to have a look at some of that and we can rewatch it.
Hey, man, something to look forward to, something to rally the troops.
Definitely. Well, we've always got to have a motivation, haven't we? So yeah, as I say, I think we'll just kind of get straight back into the Nations of Sanity project. As I say, for people listening, it's based on this assertion that we should basically define law by the concept of individual self-ownership. In other words, make the NAP, the non-aggression principle, the law and establish it as the terms of a peace agreement. And one of my kind of, I'll probably just start off with this, because one of the kind of things that really motivated me to kind of revisit this with you, and it's something I want to kind of speak to people about, is in my mind, this idea is the logical conclusion to the logical journey that libertarians have already begun, but I don't understand why they've not reached this final conclusion. When I first discovered libertarianism and the non-aggression principle of self-ownership, a lot of it just resonated with me as putting language on stuff I already believed in, but wasn't familiar with all of these terms. So when I come across libertarianism, I'm like, yeah, these people get it. They get that we can only have right over ourselves coherently, and we get that coherent property rights come from that through first use principles and voluntary trade and creation, and all the things that follow on from that. And most libertarians seem to understand that the only form of force that's justifiable is that which protects rights, therefore enforcing the non-aggression principle, if you like. So for me, a lot of libertarians kind of sort of stop there or maybe just pass there. But like the final steps that took me to the idea that I present through the Nations Sanity Project is to say, well, okay, if the non-aggression principle is undeniably the only justifiably enforceable standard of law, then we should make it the law. And the only way we can make it the law without contradicting itself is to do it through the terms of a peace agreement. Because obviously, if it was, there's two sort of ways that we can establish law. We can either establish it as the terms of peace between people, or we can establish it as the dictates of a ruling authority. But obviously, the dictates of a ruling authority would contradict the principle because ruling authorities would be criminalized by this law. So the only, so to keep everything coherent and consistent and taking that logical journey that libertarians have begun, I just think that this is the kind of logical end. And I've got sort of other arguments why I think this is something that we should kind of all get behind, because I think there's a kind of real utility behind this idea in its simplicity that kind of although it's like the morally pure principle, end that I feel like we should get to, and it's our, and it defines our free society. But I also think it alludes to how we get there. It's a little bit. I often liken it a little bit to, like, we abolished slavery, but we didn't do it properly because we didn't do it fully. We only abolished this narrowly defined form of slavery, and we didn't abolish other forms of slavery like statism. And also, we abolished it under the dictates of ruling authorities for the most part. Although there were peace treaties that were later put in place, slavery was initially abolished under the authority of various empires and governments, which obviously, again, is not the right way to do it. So I'm kind of like, well, okay, well, as libertarians, we should want to do that, but properly. Abolish all forms of slavery, statism, and basically all NAP violating coercion, and do it through a peace agreement where we're not invoking anybody having authority over anybody else, but simply saying, okay, these are the terms of peace between all peaceful people. Sorry, I went on a little bit there, but that's kind of like, that's where I'm coming from in this. And I really appreciate you coming on here, because I really want to bounce these off you and kind of get you to scrutinize and help me see where I'm wrong, or where I need to kind of change my outlook, or if I don't, why aren't other libertarians already on board with this? Why is this not already the message?
Great questions. Got a couple things I want to relate that have occurred to me while you were speaking. I had a moment similar to yours as a very young man. Uh, I suppose I was brought up somewhat as a Democrat, even though politics wasn't in my household, but all the good guys in TV and movies were, Democrats. It was those evil Republicans that wanted to rule the world. Then I figured out that the government doesn't have any money that it goes to do all these wonderful things with. It steals it first. So I'm like, oh, I must be a Republican. And a couple of months of listening to Rush Limbaugh disabused me of that notion. So I'm like, what am I? And then I read The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, and then immediately went to Atlas Shrugged. And it's a marvelous book, highly recommend it. And as I'm finishing it, I'm like, well, this isn't a problem. This person here is, she's got a few things maybe wrong, but she's hit on the nub of it. We don't have to live this way where we're just all voting every 2 to 4 years to predate upon each other. Just follow these principles and everything will be fine. Just a few people need to read this book. Then I look at the copyright page and it's 1957, and I'm like, oh. And it's, the second most popular book at the time next to the Bible or something. I think she held that record for a long time. So I'm like, oh, a lot of people have read this and they don't want this. That's a problem. And I think the biggest reason that most normies don't look at libertarianism, this applies to anarchism, obviously, but even just a super minimal state, I think most people, most normies would say, yeah, but there's this thing called public goods, and we simply cannot coordinate their production or existence even at a big enough volume without having somebody with a bullhorn and a gun marching around giving orders to everybody. And so it's for these reasons. Again, I think the pseudo economists have just screwed us by creating this fantasy term. That's just an assertion that you won't have enough of whatever it is, whether it's security or law, which are, at the far end of the tail, or things like, the dam or the roads, the standard ubiquitous complaint that you need somebody with a bunch of guns to make these things happen, and force coordination if the silly humans won't coordinate on their own. And I say that's nonsense. There is no market failure. Anything that you're calling a public good that couldn't actually get created in a condition of freedom isn't a thing that should exist. And it's just your assertion that it should exist or there should be more. That's your personal preference. Um, so I'm in agreement with you. We should all live in anarchic relations between one another, coordinating through free association, voluntarism, contract. I'm a big fan of the contract. And that's the proper way for humans to exist in a political arrangement, is voluntarily. So your question is, how on earth do we get from here to there? And why isn't everybody beating down Matthew Sands's door to get on this Nations of Sanity project? What's the mismatch? So in order to try and figure it out, I want to ask some questions. That's not true. One more thing I got to get off my chest. A lot of people I speak to that are anarchists or say they are and want to get from here to there, they still have this intuition that what we'll do is pass a law or something will happen, a miracle will occur, and then all of a sudden the landmass or geographical unit that you're in will convert from statism to something where the nap is followed. And they don't have a real clear idea like how that would happen. But I think in everybody's head, because we were indoctrinated by the state, they think it'll be a blob, some geographic unity where here the nap is the watchword, and elsewhere it would be a state. And I think that is the wrong intuition. It's not how it would happen. Obviously, there'd be clumps of people together, but you could have anarchy um, completely dispersed. It's a relationship. It's not an area. It's a relationship between parties. And I only bring that up because I know a lot of people listening who are interested in that. I know they still think of it that way. Like Canada converted to Anarchistan, but America is still statist or something like that. It wouldn't necessarily be that way. Um, so my question to you is, in your mind, how do we get from every single person is owned by a state to somehow that not being the case? I don't think you're thinking of politicians signing this peace treaty. I think you're talking about individuals signing it. And so I'd be like, okay, all the few thousands of people on this earth that are anarchists, we signed this treaty, and then what? Because there's still the men with the bullhorns and the guns taxing us every day and ordering us around. So, like, now what?
Well, the way I kind of envisage it is I kind of say that the destination is also the path to it, in the sense that, and again, I go back to the slavery example, because although it was done in sort of stages in a way, because different, like the British Empire had abolished it before America did, and, and then eventually treaties were done between countries and stuff like that. But the basic point of it was, and this also, I think, goes towards dispelling some of the misconceptions that particularly the normies have with regards to how things can continue without government, particularly if they've only ever associated it with government. It's a little bit like, well, how did the cotton industry continue when slavery was abolished? Well, the beauty of it was it just had to work it out itself. We didn't have to get involved with the micromanaging details of shrinking the cotton industry or anything like that. The cotton industry had to adapt under this new paradigm of slavery was no longer a legitimate thing. It was now formally recognized as a crime because it had been abolished. And as a result, the cotton industry had to adapt and employ people, voluntarily and move on from there. And I think that's a good way of kind of certainly selling it to the normies, in the sense of really trying to hammer through the fact that you're not getting rid of anything that they might associate with government that they value. You're just simply taking away that coercive element. Just like the cotton industry will carry on without slavery, we can still have even public goods and services without what we would call slavery, but statism, because it would just continue under that new paradigm if statism or nat violating coercion was abolished in the way that slavery was, and the way that the industry just has to change like that. Because one of the reasons why I'm a kind of anarchist rather than a minarchist is I think it's kind of pointless to try to shrink a malignant tumor, when if you can take the malignancy out of it, it will shrink itself. Like if you took any public institution and just took the coercive power of government away from it, that public institution may disappear. It may grow even stronger, but that would
Sure.
be fully down to the free market principles of meritocracy, rather than the corrupt, coercive elements that keep it going as it is, and which basically guarantee the corruption. So my kind of way of getting there is to kind of say, well, we need to actually we need, and like there's a message that we present it to the normies, but my kind of message to libertarians in particular is libertarians already get a lot of all of this, like the stuff that we need to convince the normies of libertarians, particularly anarchists, already get this. But I don't feel like we're presenting a coherent, united message. Like I say, it's not about getting behind me or this particular project, but this idea. Like I say, I don't understand why this idea, in my mind, it is the next logical steps. Like there's a kind of undeniability to it as the way I think of it, and I just feel like I feel like if libertarians actually kind of came together to kind of scrutinize this idea, I feel like it would kind of remain undefeated. And I feel like because the problem is when
I don't know
outsiders,
why it would be remain undefeated though, because there's a force problem. Like, say it's you and me, and we sign the thing, and it's like, yay, we don't have to obey the state anymore. No, they just come along and shoot us. So, like, us signing this agreement doesn't do anything to the state. What would do something to the state is if we convinced, a significant percentage of the population to demand this type of a system of justice where nobody, including the state, is allowed to steal or kill or extort, imprison, conscript. But the thing is, most people don't agree with us. So a handful of us sign this thing, and then they say, "Great, that's cute. Give me your money, or I'm gonna throw you in a cage." And because, like, the principles you're talking about, I think all of us agree on, or super minor distinctions. The principal one being no one can force somebody else into a relationship with them that's not completely and utterly voluntary in every single way. We're already on board with that, and various legal scholars have, fleshed out some of the principles that are likely to arise as humans bump up against one another in messy ways in the condition of anarchy, and what sort of institutions and principles would help sort that out. But that doesn't do anything to make the state go away. So what does that? And if it's just convincing more folks, then you are in perfect agreement with everybody. Because, signing the contract you're talking about is really just the natural condition of statelessness, right? You can't aggress against me. It's in the air. You don't have a state to do it, and you're not going to do it. Or, you meet my security agency and the types of court systems Rothbard and Kinsella and Hoppe and others have envisioned. So, yeah, I don't know. It's either there isn't a difference and you're not just barking into the wind, everybody agrees with you, or it's just a question of, well, yeah, but nobody has managed to solve the problem of how we get there other than just convincing normies to not be normies.
yeah, I suppose from my point of view, it's more about focusing the message into a more concise and specific solution. Like I say, establishing the NAP as law
Oh,
through a
that's
peace agreement.
interesting.
Like,
That's
sorry,
interesting.
go on.
No, you're making me see it a little bit better. If it's a sales gimmick, or a mnemonic, don't you agree in peace? How about everybody have a peace agreement between them? That could be a thing. If that was marketed correctly, you'd still have the people going, yeah, but you can't really live as a society because of public goods and we need a government. But it is something that'll prick their consciousness. Like, oh yeah, nobody really does have the right to violate peace. So that's I don't know what to call it. Salesmanship gimmick isn't the right word, but like a persuasion technique. It could be a good persuasion technique.
Well, I certainly think there's a potential for it to appeal kind of widely, like, left and right and everybody who doesn't bother with that particular, puppet show. But, like, I feel like it has a wide appeal because because I mean, one of the things I often say to people when I kind of often talk about how I don't get involved with the socialism versus capitalism thing, and I really try to focus on the freedom angle, because I don't, when I speak to kind of people of a left-wing persuasion, I don't try to convert them from a progressive or a socialist to a capitalist in an economic sense. I try to just convert them from an authoritarian statist to a freedom, loving voluntarist. And that's not so difficult because a lot
Oh,
of
I
them,
don't know, man.
okay, go on.
Did you ever see you know what the Soho Forum is? Gene Epstein's thing in New York,
Uh,
debate series.
yeah, I've seen some of those, yeah.
Gene sometimes himself, he normally moderates them, but sometimes he takes one side of an issue, and he was debating some socialist, and he's like, "Look, man, under a system of capitalism, the state way stripped down and not being so regulatory and taxes and whatnot, but under a system of free markets, you can have your socialist paradise. You just do it with everybody who wants to organize things the way you do, and you sign a contract and bibbity boom." They're just not persuaded because, gosh darn it, they need it to be a little bit bigger and it needs to include you. They need to be able to drag you in and force you to participate. They're never like, it's never enough to just be let alone. It's like, no, man, socialism is coming for you.
Well, I mean, don't get me wrong. I agree. There's certainly many people that fit that description, but I do also encounter many that don't. That, for example, like many that will complain about like how a lot of these programs that they want are like corrupted and whatever. And I just kind of point out that the coercion guarantees that corruption, and maybe these
Absolutely.
programs would work better. You know,
Absolutely.
it's a little bit like the whole although obviously taxation is theft is an undeniably true statement, but when you're talking to a left winger, maybe it's better to say, look, if your taxes were voluntary, if you had a choice about where they went, and or even if you paid them at all, can you imagine how much better the institutions that you support would be? Because they would be forced to rise their standards to a level that's worthy of your voluntary participation.
That's a great point, Matthew. And we don't share it enough. But obviously, we think that once you take away everything the state does, including welfare systems, then what you'd have in its place is voluntary institutions like we used to have. These associations of trade unionists or things based around a church or a particular locality where people realize that the future is uncertain. And so it makes sense to band together and disperse some of the risk. And obviously, those things would exist without the state taxing us and crowding out the natural incentive for man to help his fellow man, thinking, I gave it the office, and isn't that the thing the government should do? The coercion is pure evil and poison. It poisons our relationships to one another. And I would hope that you're right, that a left winger would see that and not just have such distrust in his fellow man. Again, it's a public goods sort of an argument. It's like, yeah, but there wouldn't be enough charity, because I honestly think it's a projection. Like they know the evil in their own hearts. Like, well, I wouldn't give anything. Well, not everyone's like that. I mean, the religious community, for all the reasons some people like to look down on them, they are very charitable. They think it's part of what Christ has called them to do. And I think you just get more and more and more of that once you're A, not taxed into oblivion, and B, um, not convinced that it's silly for you to do it. What are you? I'm not a social worker. I'm not trained for this. I can't get together with my local group and actually try and help conditions. So I think you're right again. That's a great argument for attack, so to speak, to persuade people that we don't talk about enough.
And also another thing, and I do lead again with this when I talk to people of a left-wing persuasion, particularly those that kind of value a lot of the public institutions that are currently obviously, controlled by government, is I kind of point out that because one of the things I don't like, I don't agree, and this may differ me from certainly a lot of right wingers, but certainly even other libertarians, is I don't like privatization under the current system because it just feels like furtherance of the theft. It's like someone steals your car and then they sell off the parts. So your chance of ever getting what you was stolen from you back is even. And
Plus, plus most quote unquote privatization is nothing of the kind. What does it mean for the state to say we are going to grab you and throw you in a cage? Oh, but not to worry, those aren't government employees running the prisons. That's a private prison. We've privatized us. Like, what? No, you haven't. You've created this bizarre monopoly staffed by your cronies, and it's just the same thing as they follow your rules, right? You're not going to let anybody go. Yeah, I hate when people say privatize. You're like, what do you mean exactly?
Yeah, and a lot of people, and that resonates with a lot of people on the left because a lot of them they think of how they've been robbed of their private institutions rather than
Yeah.
seeing government as something that robs them. They feel like they're being robbed when things that they've paid for through generations of taxes and that suddenly get sold off and privatized. I mean, that's why Maggie Thatcher was very much hated in this country by so many people because they felt like, I mean, obviously many people loved her, but certainly on the left, most people hated her. And a large part of that was they felt like she just took from us what little we had as working class people, or that kind of message. Like, that's why things like the NHS and stuff is valued, and the same people that value the NHS and wouldn't want to ever lose it will complain every day about how broken and corrupted and mismanaged it is. Some will even say underfunded, although But again, and this is where I kind of lead with this idea and this kind of simple message by sort of saying, well, look, imagine we abolished statism and like we abolished slavery, like this idea. So imagine we did that rather than all the stuff that all the public stuff being sold off under your nose, it's now returned to you. You know, like the public, I would say, would, you know, arguably be like, you know, equal ownership. And now,
For people who want some idea of how that would work, look to theorists like Murray Rothbard and Stephan Kinsella. I think even Hoppe talked about it. It's not right to simply say, yeah, what happened is the government would just sell it off to the highest bidder. The proper owner is some sort of a combination between who was taxed to fund it and maybe who was caretaking it or something like that. So you couldn't just rewind time and go to homestead principles, and it's not fair for the thief to auction it off. That doesn't make any sense. You have to have some principle by which the people who this public property was extorted from, somehow they have to receive an ownership stake or something, try to make them whole in some way. And it won't be perfect, obviously, but that's the principle.
well, yeah, because even if it was sold off, it's like, well, who's getting that money? Like, say,
Who's
who's
getting the
selling it
money?
to? You know,
Exactly.
exactly.
Yeah.
So there's you know, essentially you've got all of this public property that essentially, you know, the best you can do for a rightful owner would be the public. And the thing is, I think we can just look to kind of private property issues, you know, to kind of work that out. You know, like, for example, if I mean, I use very kind of simplistic examples, but I'm like, again, go back to the slavery thing. Imagine you abolish slavery and you found this like big slave fortress that was built by the slaves, and you know, and they were imprisoned in it and had to work on, you know, the crops and all the rest of it. And once you liberated them, you would say, okay, well, now you lot own this fortress
That seems pretty clear. Yeah.
yeah, and then
Yeah.
and some of you'd be free to leave. You don't have to have anything to do with it. But those of you who want to stay would have an ownership in it, which means you'd have a real stake in it.
Even if you don't stay, I mean, even if you don't stay, everybody there should have a piece of stock, and they can get the
yeah,
hell out of there if they want, but they still have an ownership
yeah,
interest.
yeah. You could cash out or you could stay, but the people that
Yeah.
would stay would have a real stake in it. So you know, so there's all, you know, there's all sort of positive connotations to those things. But it's like, and that's why I feel like the best way we can approach these ideas is to simplify it to something like that. And then when we transpose it to public, it's basically the same thing, you know, without being dramatic and calling ourselves slaves. It's the same thing. Just like you would say that those slaves were the rightful owner of the slave fortress that they were forced to build, the public are the rightful owners of the public property that we were forced to build,
Yeah.
fund, you know, whatever. So I think that's quite a simplest, you know, I think that's, you know, quite a simple thing. And I think that would appeal to a lot of these lefties that value these institutions, because it's the only, like I say to people, if you want to save the NHS in England, the only way to save it is to remove the coercion so that it's then subject to free market principles of meritocracy. Sure. And I think it's got a hell of a good chance of surviving, because it would be one of the biggest health insurance companies in this country, because it's already a national size, and although people will be free to jump ship, it's already got all this stuff established as infrastructure, you know. Same with the regulated market, same with the road, same with everything, you know what I mean? It's like we've already got this leg up. We would inherit this stuff, and the only thing we have to predict is the coercion.
It's hard to predict. It's hard to predict because, yes, they've inherited all this stuff, but stuff is tradable and fungible. But they've also inherited a corrupt system with absolutely all the wrong incentives. So they would have to turn on a dime. I don't think you could keep the same administrators. You have to turn from socialism to entrepreneurialism. I don't know if those same people could do it, but it doesn't matter. That's a beautiful thing. You just take away the coercion and see what happens. But it would be better, that's for darn sure. There's a couple different ways I'm thinking of.
Sorry, just to cut in as well, and I don't want to keep beating the abolishing slavery example, but it does keep resonating again. Just like I say, the cotton industry, we don't have to worry about the specifics on how the cotton industry changed. It just had to change because it could no longer use slavery. And it's the same with our public institutions. We don't have to go through the micromanaging of it. It will deal with it. The market will fix it for us because freedom will take over.
And it's a more apt analogy than maybe you even think, because like most left-wing historians think that the cotton trade couldn't have existed without slavery, and so that if we remove slavery for moral reasons, well, yeah, that darn cotton industry is gonna have some problems, but they're just gonna have to adapt. Like, you really think a system based on slavery is efficient? Does let it even make sense? From the perspective of a plantation owner, these aren't free laborers. They went to the slave market and bought them like a capital good. And then you have to have the expense of feeding them, housing them, overseeing them with men with guns so they won't run away. That whole horrible system. You're really trying to tell me that that system, which costs a lot of money, oh, and you get not employees, but you get workers who hate you. If they have a good idea about how to run this place better, you think they're going to tell you? No, no, no. They're more likely to shirk. They're more likely to destroy your stuff if they feel like they can get away with that. Contra, freedom of association and offering a wage. I think, I mean, I haven't dug into it myself, but I'm quite certain that the industry that employed slaves held itself back for several decades because it's a horrible system for all people. So yeah, to take it back to your NHS or whatever, the public institutions, yes, of course they're going to run better once you take coercion and slavery out of the mix. That can't be the most uh, productive way to do anything. Throwing aside the morality, it will work better if you don't have all this thieving and bureaucracy and no incentive to improve anything. I mean, bureaucrats want their fiefdoms to grow. You know, they don't ever want to cut costs or find a way to some labor saving device. So last thing they want. Um, I would like to mention, I told you off air, Stephan Kinsella and a couple other people created this thing that I hope you'll put in the show notes called the Universal Principles of Liberty. It came out late last year, I think. Um, and what it is like you were talking about the way you'd organize a free society. If the state were to collapse, or say you went to the moon and were trying to orchestrate some new sort of a thing, a lot of people who grew up as statists would say, yeah, but you'd probably want a constitution or something. It's like, no, you don't, because a constitution literally is a thing that creates a state. But it is useful to have an organizing bedrock of principles that all parties literally sign on to, and then use that as a bedrock. And all sorts of organizations can sort of be laid on top with that as a philosophical guide. Um, so please check that out. It's a beautiful thing. It's not just a bunch of text. The link we're going to share is actually this beautiful old scroll looking thing with a preamble and a bunch of terms. And I encourage everybody to read it. It's called The Universal Principles of Liberty. And if all relations between people were governed by these principles, not laws, principles, we would be in a much better place.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and I definitely will. Well, maybe not about a quibble on the law part, but I definitely agree about that. And I mean, Stephan Kinsella, one of the things I love about his work is, and he's helped me a lot with my own work, and obviously, refining this idea, is he adds so much clarity to the principles. And I haven't looked at this myself, but I'm very intrigued by it, and I will take a
When
look
you
at it.
do, let me underscore something to be clear. You will almost certainly live in a society with laws. These are just principles that are like the air you breathe. It would be, you could still make a law that violates them, but somebody would look at it and go, there's something wrong there. But yes, of course, we will be governed by laws, because when you do something that harms another and you violated your contract, I mean, that's basically a law we're talking about at this point, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and well, that's why I think something like this would be invaluable for well, even the idea that I'm trying to talk about, because it would make a great reference. Because it's all very well having the simplistic of idea of saying let's make the NAP the law, but when you want to explore, okay, well, what does that mean? What are the implications? How does it apply to these various things? I mean,
Yeah.
Stephan's already an invaluable source for that kind of thing. I mean, obviously he's well known on the IP front, but he's also written great books about law itself and how the non-aggression principle relates to it. I think I've mentioned to you before how he even helped me refine my understanding of property rights, because I always used to say rightful ownership comes from creation of voluntary trade, and then he kind of pulled me up on that and he said, well, actually no, it comes from first use principles. Creation and voluntary trade just they follow on from that. Once you've got the the materials you own, you can make something with that and you can trade it
Yeah.
with other people. But
They're usually massively correlated, but that's not the essence. Yeah,
exactly. And
he's
sorry,
great.
go on. Yeah, well, and the thing is about something like that that's so important, and this is why I feel like Stephan's work is so important to the libertarian movement as a whole, is he gives you that extra clarity. And it might on the surface seem like a kind of, well, same difference thing, but it's not, because what it does is it
Not
draws a more precise line back to the founding principle of individual self-ownership. Because I own myself and you own yourself, and we're both walking in the woods, and in wild woods we're talking about, and we come across an apple tree. If I pick an apple, which you had just as equal right to pick as I did, but once I've picked it, it's mine, because I didn't aggress against anyone to get it. Whereas if you come along and take it from me, you're having to aggress to do that. It's so simple, it's almost childlike, but it actually strikes at such an important element of why property rights comes from self-ownership as a kind of objectively identifiable thing. And this comes back to why, like there's a correct logic to the libertarian principle. There's a correct answer. I feel like it's almost like the mathematics of morality, in a sense. You know what I mean? Like, once you understand that 2 + 2 = 4, you can understand more complicated sums. You might have to work them out a little bit. You might have to do your work, and and carry the one, and make sure you got your principles right. And that's people don't do that perfectly all the time, which is why there are debates on things like IP and stuff. But that doesn't mean there's not an objectively correct answer. And as Stephan has pointed out, it is, once you delve into it and do the maths with regards to working from that principle, you can't justify IP laws, you can't justify intellectual property as actually property. You know what I mean? Whereas
I'm
sorry, go on.
I think you're right. I just want to make an even wilder claim. Like, yes, of course, like any non-contradictory logical system, you can work out the maths and come out with the right answer, um, in most situations anyway. But I think it's even deeper than that. I think it is inherent in the structure of the universe and the structure of our nature as a creature, the design of our system and any sentient creature. I think these are just the right ways for any living thing that can reason and do all the things humans do when they make an agreement or something. I think that's the right way for not the right way, the right relationship between all sentient beings is this one: libertarian, stateless, voluntarist anarchism. And I think everything else is a deviation, and not just, yes, this would be better, but something about what's inherent in our nature. I truly believe that's the case. But just to push back against the autists, because that's what we all are, um, just because you know the libertarian principles, that doesn't automatically tell you what the law is going to be in any given society or situation, because the principles are always have to be embedded in a certain context, and the culture is a context. Like, is shining a flashlight in your neighbor's light aggression? How about 1/1000th of the wattage? What about noise violations? Say we're walking in the forest that's unowned and we spy the apple tree. Okay, you get to the apple first and grab it. Maybe I get to it and another one and I grab it. Those two apples are, our property respectively. But how do you handle if you start trying to build a fence going one way and I start trying to build one the other way, and then we meet at the end where it's enclosed? It's like, well, yeah, we got a fenced off orchard, but whose is it? There's always going to be this weird wiggle room, and don't be surprised if the way that fleshes out, and this is another brilliant insight of Stephan Kinsella, that's going to get fleshed out over thousands and thousands and thousands of court cases. And the people using their reason are going to try and institute these principles to the situation that's before them. And over time, what is going to get generated through the messy product of, we err, humans do, sometimes we'll get it wrong, but over time, as we keep trying to apply various principles to sticky situations, something will come up with it that's libertarianism in this context, and it will be the best way for humans to relate, I promise you.
For sure. I mean, yeah, we've still got to apply these principles in the context of the imperfect human interpretations that are inevitable. I mean, one of the kind of solutions that's embedded in the like the Nations of Sanity project, because the idea of establishing the Napa's law isn't just that idea on its own. It's a kind of 3-part like peace agreement that we present, where I say part 1 is the basic agreement. Part 2 is what we call lines in the sand, which is where we draw lines, like our limits of tolerance over differing interpretations. And then part 3 is about ratifying rightful ownership through this principle. But the point of part two, and this kind of, because when I first kind of presented this idea, like, like I say, I came across this thing, but surely if the non-aggression principle is only justifiable law, we should make it law, and surely we should do it for a peace agreement. That was all very simple. But one of the things that did become apparent to me quite quickly through having conversations with people like yourself who make this very point that you just made is, what about the fuzzy edges? What about the gray areas? What about the differing interpretations? And for me, we can still bring it back to self-ownership, because a little bit like we have this beyond reasonable doubt standard in like criminal law today, that's actually a standard I think we would keep, not just with regards to proving guilt or innocence, but also with regards to identifying whether something even is a crime. So
I agree.
when I think we can draw this line in the sand where things are definitely violations of the non-aggression principle, we can draw a line in the sand and say, okay, you're not allowed to do that. And obviously things that definitely not, you've got that kind of, definitely you're free as
I
you are.
agree.
Sorry,
I'm
go on.
sorry, but I
Yeah.
before I forget it, I just have to say this. I totally agree. I heartily encourage you to read these universal principles of liberty, because you might find them to be exactly what you're talking about. You're calling them zones 1, zones 2, or whatever. I'd flip it perpendicularly and just call this a foundation, and then all sorts of rules get drawn on top of it, and that'll be subject to the desires of the people entering into agreements. Maybe you want to live in a socialist thing, and so you all sign the contract, and okay, whoop-de-doo, there you go. Um, but as far as like, one of the great things about what Stephan did is he's a student of legal history. And so all sorts of things that we think are pretty essential about like the criminal justice system that built up over millennia. That's all in there, because you might not necessarily have to have 12 jurors or whatever, but it's a really good idea to have something like that where you're not just being judged by elites, and it's something completely different, and standards of evidence and things like that. Um, you might find yourself adopting the universal principles of liberty as the basis of your peace agreement. It
Well,
could
well,
easily
as
just look like that, and you say, yeah, why don't we all just sign this?
well as I say, I mean, Stephan as a person has already been a great source for me to kind of, help me refine my understanding of these ideas. And everything you're telling me about this does sound like this is almost a perfect resource for the Nations of Sanity project to fall back on in regards to kind of showing how these details work themselves out. And another thing I wanted to point out with regards to this kind of lines in the sand approach and this beyond reasonable doubt approach that we apply to criminal law and we can apply to identifying the NAP as well, is there's also a beautiful self-policing element to this, because one of the strongest incentive for against sort of kangaroo courts and against kind of lazy prosecutions of people is the reason why the reason why this principle would dictate that you would have to have this beyond reasonable doubt kind of assertive, is because if you use force against somebody who is a criminal and deserves it, then that's all fine. That's part of your, right within the non-aggression principle. But if you use force against somebody where you don't have that reasonable certainty, then you are the one who is guilty of criminal
That's
recklessness
right.
and kidnapping and assaulting and whatever else you may do
That's
to this
right.
person. So that's because one of the things where I've kind of, particularly when I speak to minarchists about, where they sort of talk about, oh, well, how are you going to keep control of a legal system when there's no ruling authority to keep them all in check? And I'm like, well, when you have a ruling authority, that's when it goes haywire, because you've got something that can be corrupted and there's no accountability. Like things like qualified immunity would not exist in a free society,
For
because
sure.
no one would be able to grant that immunity because no one would possess it in the first place, So
There's a couple insights that are important there. The first is just competition. You find yourself in danger of being put before a kangaroo court. Well, you don't have to use that legal system. Nobody does. And also, as you say, there are no two-tiered systems of justice in anarchy, as there are in every single status situation where the cops are literally above the law by definition. You don't have that in a state of voluntarism and anarchy. And if you find somebody violating your rights because it wasn't you that did this, well then, and presumably there'd be some provisions where like maybe you can be detained or something if it's not positive who's the thing. But if they go beyond the contractual nature of your relationship, you can go to another security agency and go after them. There's no immunity, qualified or otherwise. No, man, you're just another human like the rest of us. You don't get to act like a bully. Sorry.
Exactly. Yeah, that and well, I mean, and it kind of it echoes the sentiment of what I was talking about before with regards to all these public institutions. And when you're selling this to the lefties and saying, look, all of the things that you value and want,
Yeah.
they would flourish under this system, and if they
Yeah.
didn't flourish, they didn't deserve to flourish, you know. And like you say, this legal system, there's such a self-policing nature, because then all of a sudden, I mean, imagine this: accountability, law enforcement that are subject to the same laws they enforce. Could you imagine such a world? You know what I mean? It's
It's a beautiful
crazy.
thing. It's a beautiful thing. I don't know if you recommend to your listeners books on anarchy, but there are a few and they're pretty great. And the hardest thing to get people to understand what we're talking about is to flip their intuitions, get them into this paradigm and not just thinking we're talking a bunch of gibberish. So yeah, there's a few books that are great. A couple by Rothbard, one by Bob Murphy. The Tannehills wrote a pretty good one. There's one called The Ethics of Anarchy by Chris. I forget his last name. Sorry, but if you want to put a list in the video description of a few things, like if you're just not getting it, this just sounds like nonsense. It's not. You just need to understand a little bit more. Oh, and you know the Problem of Political Authority by Michael Huemer is always a good one. Like, what makes you think that it's even appropriate for state actors to have authority over us? Where do you think that comes from? Question yourself. So, yeah, I recommend a little bit of a bibliography. Maybe we'll work on together behind the scenes.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, if you send me some links, I'll definitely include them in the description. I like to give, I mean, 100%, obviously, I'm going to include links to your work, but 100%, I'm going to put a link for what we've been talking about with Stephan's latest work, because apart from the fact that it's incredibly relevant to what we're talking about and this idea, but as I say, I think Stephan is an invaluable source for a lot of this. And the other people you mentioned, people like Bob Murphy and that, have done great work as well. And one of the things as well, and again, I'm going to put this back to kind of pitching my idea again, but I do think that this kind of simplistic idea, let's abolish, you know, NAP violating coercion, is a great kind of foot in the door. And then like Stephan's work expands on like kind of the implications of these principles that we're talking about. Okay, well, what is this principle you want to make law? What's that all about? And then all of these other things can kind of, you know, like people can then go deeper, like they can look at this book about how these economics work, you know. And there's so many myths that need to be dispelled along the way. But I think our best foot forward is our destination. It is our abolish slavery approach.
I
And
have
just
uh,
sorry, go on.
I have another helpful persuasion tip because a lot of people may think when you say let's just abolish statism, like that doesn't mean anything. You know, they got tanks. What are you talking about? Um, what it kind of means is yes, yes, we need to convince many, many, many more people to want this. But once we do, what abolishing statism means is that if you're not willing to sign a contract with me that's based on some sort of a libertarian anarchist NAP basis, I don't have to have anything to do with you. That's what it means to abolish statism. You who want to be a statist, none of us are just going to have anything to do with you because you're an outlaw. You're not a trustworthy agent. You think you can call on the king and beat me over the head and take my money? No, you're a barbarian. That's what it means to abolish statism. I won't do anything. I will not let you in my store. I won't have you over to dinner. You can't come on my property because you're behaving like an animal. Sign this contract. That's a much more reasonable way for humans to deal with one another. That's what it means to abolish statism. You're not invited unless you're a civilized person.
Yeah, no, I like that approach, and 100% agree with how you're framing it. And I just to kind of add to it, I would sort of say that the thing is with this kind of abolishing slavery approach, the reason why I kind of like it is like when we were talking about before about how, oh, you could have 1,000 people that agree to this principle and it doesn't do anything because there's still this big government with guns. And that's exactly the same as 1,000 abolitionists back in the day of slavery
True,
all agreeing not to do slavery.
true.
You know, that's all well and good. And just as but and this is kind of this comes back to my kind of gripe, for want of a better word, with kind of libertarians in general. And I know we shouldn't kind of it's hard to kind of herd us into a kind of, it doesn't apply to all of us. Herding cats is the kind of phrase that always comes to mind when it comes to trying to unite libertarians on anything.
For sure.
But I do feel like that's where we are falling down at the moment. It's like, if I likened us to abolitionists in the past, it's like, okay, it's all very well abolitionists saying we're not going to practice slavery or condemning it as a practice. But what we really need to get together is to get together under this idea of abolishing it. And that's not going to happen with 1,000 people agreeing to it. But when we've got that focused idea of doing that one simple thing, that's when eventually you've got to get to a tipping point. I mean, you hit the nail on the head when you said you're still going to need a tipping point, and that's something that all libertarians understand. But what I don't think all libertarians understand, or which I feel they're missing, that the Nations of Sanity project presents, is yes, but the reason we're not, or the thing that's slowing us down to getting to that tipping point, is we don't have an actual specific idea, like abolish slavery, abolish statism, like that specific idea. We kind of dance around that idea, but I feel like we don't all land on it and present this to the world and say, look, this is what we represent. People have too
I would
many
be very
misconceptions.
curious, again, I'd be very curious if after reading Universal Principles of Liberty, you might say, no, this is it. And this is what we need to present. Because just the words abolish statism or whatever, that's not enough. Like, what are you talking about? But this is a document, and it's in the form of a Declaration of Independence or a charter. Again, it's not a constitution, because that would be just as bad, but it's in the form of. And give it a read and get back to me, see what you think.
But again, that would also be a little bit like, and I'm sorry to use the same tired example, but a little bit like, if Nations of Sanity is like the abolitionists saying let's abolish slavery, then maybe, and I can't really speak about it until I look at it, but from what you're saying, it sounds like what Stephan Kinsella's work is doing is providing the details. Because obviously when slavery was abolished, like for example, when the British Empire abolished slavery, they didn't just say slavery's abolished. There were details on what that meant. You can't do this, you can't do that, because all these things qualify as slavery. And I feel like from what you're saying, Stephan's work sounds a lot like that, in the sense of, it's all very well me presenting this simplistic idea of let's make the NAP the law, but okay, well, what would that entail? Well, an exploration of the implications of that principle is kind of here, 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 and here, and it gives you a more kind of in-depth picture of okay, well, what does that actually mean, and what are the specifics to that?
Well, let's make sure you're not engaged in a contradiction in terms yourself. Like the abolitionists, they didn't just persuade. The persuasion was what got them to the point where they could do more. But once they'd done that, they grabbed the power of the central state and abolished the idea that one person can own another. It's not legal anymore. We'll throw you in a cage if you try that. Similarly with the British, because they're a state. So they got in their boats and they sailed the ocean, and if they found slave-holding boats, they'd board them and kill all the slave traders and free all the people. But what they're using is a nation state, the power of that to do that. And I don't know if that's the way you're thinking. It's akin to what I said, like right at the top. You're snapping your fingers, and now all of a sudden the state is a nap state. And I don't think that's a thing that can happen.
Well, I mean, I would characterize it slightly differently, because although you're right, they did use the power of the state, but more importantly, what they done was they enforced the formalized understanding that this is now a crime. So,
Sure.
and like I say, and we can establish that formalized understanding. Law doesn't have to be established by a ruling authority. It can be established as the terms of peace. I mean, that's what international law is between countries already. That's not, there's no one world government that says to all the different countries, this is international law. International law is established through treaties. Through, obviously the difference is that's between states, which, we don't recognize as valid entities. But under that framework, and in fact, I remember an objectivist said this to me once. He said, oh, we already have anarchism on an international level. And at first I didn't know what he was on about, but then I realized he was talking about the fact that there wasn't a world government. So each nation operates like how we want people to be able to operate in an anarchist society as equal parties, and then the laws between them being essentially established as peace agreements, still formalized as laws, still backed with force, but not under the authority of anyone saying I'm in charge of you or you're in charge of me, but really just saying, okay, well, we're equals and we're agreeing not to fight each other under these terms of peace, you know. And that's what this is in regards to what I'm presenting in that. So, you know, like the slavery example doesn't always work perfectly because, as you say, that was done under the enforcement of the state. But that comes back to my point about when I say that's the problem with how we abolished slavery. We didn't do it properly. The two problems with how we abolished slavery is, one, we only abolished the narrow form of slavery and not including statism and stuff like that. But the other problem is that we done it under the authority of essentially slave owners. You know what I mean? Rather than it would be like a slave owner saying, like, no one's allowed slavery anymore except us. You know what I mean? It's kind of like that.
Right, exactly.
You know, and what we're
which
saying
is exactly what they think.
Yeah.
I mean, that is exactly what they thought at the time, because yeah, I'm sailing in a ship to free slaves and abolish the slavery, but I am, you know, an agent of the king. You're not going to dispute his authority, right? Like, no, actually, I do.
Yeah, but I think that, and again, I do think that's a great selling point, because you'll struggle to find many people that disagree with the abolition of slavery. You know what I mean? And I think that's another foot in the door, again, possibly more so for the left-wing audience, where you can say, okay, well, abolishing slavery was undoubtedly a good thing, and the reason for that is because people don't own other people and have that right. But let's not have that so narrow, because if you think about it, the ownership the government claims over us is very much the same as what a slave owner would claim over a slave, you know, and then you can point to all the things like income taxes and stuff like that. And the thing is, as divided as we are, I think this message is starting to resonate people more. You know, the left and the right are waking up to their government a bit more. And you still have exceptions. You have the left-wing authoritarians that will always be, and you saw them come out in COVID a lot. You've got the right-wing bootlickers, and, you know, you see them coming out a lot lately with, you know, supporting Trump no matter what, and the Epstein stuff and ICE and all that sort of stuff. So, you know what I mean? There's, you know, like the exceptions that you're talking about, like the hopeless socialist who just can't be talked into them, those they definitely exist. And the right-wing bootlickers, they exist in abundance. But there's also a lot of people on both the left and the right that we really can reach, because they're not left-wing because they like to steal money, and they're not right-wing because they want a fascist state. They're these things because of what they consider the virtues of those positions. You know, like, you know, a good-hearted sort of self-described socialist just wants to help people, just wants to create welfare and safety nets. And the theft side of it is something they either don't think about at all or consider perhaps a necessary price to pay. And I think both of those elements can easily be corrected in them if they are truly of that mind. Now, you still got, yeah, you've got the nasty ones who just want to take money because they're worthless, just like I say. And just like you've got so many right-wingers who talk about liberty in one breath, and then they'll want to jail you if you burn the American flag, or you know what I mean, or whatever. So,
or talk about the Second Amendment, but not for those people.
Yeah, exactly. But again, there's the hypocrisy that the left and the right see in each other, and I think it's very important that they don't see it in libertarians. I think we need to kind of, you know, bring ourselves into a kind of coherent message, so you don't have those you know, like a lot of times I've often pushed back against anybody that says the problem with libertarianism is that we're too puritanical. If anything, I feel like sometimes we're not puritanical enough, and we've allowed what a libertarian is to be diluted to such a point that, you know, left-wingers think that they're just conservatives who might smoke weed or something, and right-wingers think, oh, well, they're just liberals with better economic policy. You know what I mean? There's this kind of misconception about what libertarians are, and the truth is libertarians aren't anything other than people who accept the basic freedom that we, and again, sorry, I know I'm filibustering, but one final point I want to bring this back to, which I'm sure you'll agree in, is most people are kind of libertarians in their heart with regards to how they treat each other in a personal, you know, nobody, you know, it's only with government that we have this disconnect, you know what I mean? And I think people can be woken up because they already embrace this moral principle, which most of them learned from the age of 4 or 5, in their day-to-day interpersonal interactions. And I think it's not that hard, just like it's, you know, it's difficult in some ways, but in some other ways, I think it's actually quite easy to kind of wake people up to something like that. A little bit like how slavery was accepted until it wasn't. I think
I think
statism could get that way as well, you know?
I think you're right too. I have no idea how long it'll take, but I do think we're making progress. Again, I think the biggest problem in reaching the normies is they're again, they've been propagandized their whole lives. They just think, it wouldn't work. We wouldn't have order. There are things like public goods, and we do need a, a coercive state in order to make that happen. They just can't see it. They can't visualize it, so they can't advocate for it. And as far as libertarianism, I think it needs to be thin as opposed to thick. And the distinction there is you're either talking about a political philosophy that talks about the nature of aggression between people, or you're making it thick by importing either a left-wing bias or a right-wing bias. And the basic error there is based on a criticism I hear all the time. It's like, yeah, I used to be interested in libertarianism, but it doesn't tell you how to live your life. What kind of philosophy is that? I'm like, dude, it's just a political philosophy. It's only about the nature of force in human society. Of course, it doesn't tell you how to live your life. That's the rest of philosophy, and there's a lot of it. But I think a lot of people just don't get that. So they just think, what all the nap is telling me like what not to do. It doesn't tell me what if I have to have a work ethic, or should I cheat on my wife, or should I abandon my kids? Of course it doesn't tell you all the things that make life worth living. That's proper philosophy. We're interested in something far simpler, really, which is just, can I beat my neighbor up and take his truck? And the answer is no. But other than that, no, it doesn't tell you like whether you should want a truck or not, or whether you should invite your neighbor over for dinner. So yeah, getting back to like if libertarianism is going to be persuasive, it can't embrace culture wars except on like a personal level. Like, yes, I don't want to behave this way, but as far as what the law should be, that's all libertarianism is. And don't drag your culture into that. That's not the place for it. That's the other aspects of philosophy.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like you could be a libertarian asshole, or you could
Right.
be a libertarian saint. But the one thing that a libertarian should be is, I mean, and I don't want to kind of just repeat what you said in a different word, but the way I kind of think of it is like, well, all libertarian does, all libertarian principles do, is define your rights and freedom, and then what you do with those rights and freedom
For
is
sure.
something that is up to you. And then there are other moral philosophies or ways of like approaches like stoicism or the golden rule if you're a Christian, or there's all sorts of things you can put on top of that. I mean,
And
I find,
remember,
sorry, go on.
remember, on top of anarchy, you do have the right to make contracts. You're going to make a lot of them as you interact with other people. And you can have your apartment building that's just a bunch of swingers parties and hedonism and drugs everywhere. Or you can have your conservative community where none of that is allowed. And you all sign on the dotted line that you're going to obey that. You can have some more other place where you're allowed to punch people even, because that's our culture. We just like that. Yeah, you can have that. You just actually have to have people sign on the dotted line and agree to it. That's what the beauty of voluntarism is. You can have any social order you want. You don't have to be forced to live under those crazy hippies in San Francisco and what they think. And you don't have to live in some straight-laced, puritanical whatever. No, nobody gets to force their culture on you. That's the beauty of freedom. The only downside is you don't get to force your view of morality on them. And I think that's what releasing the ring of power is about. It's the whole point of that book. You know, give up the desire to rule others, and you'll be surprised what a peaceful, happy, proper, prosperous life you can lead.
Couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. And I love the Lord of the Rings reference as well, because that's exactly how I interpret it. It's not how do we use the ring. It's no, the ring needs to be destroyed. No one rules over anyone else, and let free people kind of continue. And I think, I mean, all these great points. I suppose to kind of sum up my kind of message with the Nations of Sanity project, not just this specific idea, which like I say, I still think this is our our logical conclusion, but also I feel like this kind of approach and framing, like a lot of what we're talking about gets lost in the socialism versus capitalism or liberal versus conservative. I mean, it's like you said, you can be a conservative voluntarist or a liberal voluntarist, or
Mm-hmm.
even if you forgive me stretching it, a commie voluntarist. As long as you're
Sure,
truly a voluntarist, you can
sure.
have your little community where each are cool. I mean, I even pointed out, I remember someone was saying on Twitter, I engaged in someone who said, communism is the most evil ideology. Prove me wrong. And I said, no, fascism is more evil than communism, simply because the evil part of communism is just the part that's the same as fascism, i.e. the authoritarianism part.
Right.
And if you take that out, which you could do with communism, because you still got the each according to their need, each according to their ability, you could still frame that in a voluntarist setup. And I even pointed to the fact that most families basically operate on that. My family is the person who got the ability, i.e. me, goes out to work. The person who has the need to eat, i.e. my son, gets fed by me. You know what I mean? But that's I have a duty to him as a parent, which is obviously slightly different. But my point is it's not evil to adopt that approach. The evil part is when you force people into it. And the reason I argued that fascism was more evil than communism was because essentially the evil part of it is baked into the definition of fascism. Like, you can't have voluntarist fascism. That truly would be an oxymoron, whereas voluntarist communism wouldn't necessarily be an oxymoron. You could envisage that. And I just kind of feel like if we kind of really kind of lead with that, with our messaging, I think we could perhaps penetrate. And it's like, it's not casting a wider net in the way that we do where we dilute the message. It's keeping the message pure, but casting a wider net in the way that purity of message, I think, will actually pierce through more people.
Right. That's exactly why I said thin libertarianism. You say pure, I say not loaded with baggage that's going to alienate at least half of the audience. Because it's not about your cultural views. It's about, do you have the right to force them on others? I don't have too much longer, but do you want to spend a little time on your other project? I've forgotten the name of it, but where we all get together and sing Kumbaya and talk libertarianism or something. What was it called?
I'll briefly mention it. Well, it's tentatively called Together Strong.
That's what I said, Kumbaya.
Well, I was thinking of renaming it Herding Cats, because that's essentially what I'm trying to do.
That's good. That's better. That's better.
And I might actually do that. But really, yeah, I mean, obviously, like I say, my Nations of Sanity project is this idea that I really, push out there as a specific idea. But I do kind of also have another kind of message to libertarians, and something I'd like to encourage, and again, bounce off you. And we probably don't have too much time to go into real detail on it, but the basic gist of it is to basically say that ideas like the Nations of Sanity project, and for example what Stephan is presenting, and any other ideas that either conflict with or support or synergize or whatever, I think we need to, as libertarians, really try to understand that we all want liberty. We're all kind of roughly on the same side, and I think we need to try to come together, not just where we agree, which I think is important, but also where we disagree. Like, one of the things, I started up a channel called Together Strong, and this isn't really, it's not as a solidified project as the Nations of Sanity, which is what it is. The Together Strong is more of a loose idea, where I just feel like I've met a lot of great libertarians along the way, and I'm not particularly well known, but I've interviewed people who are very well known, like yourself and Stephan Kinsella and Walter Block, and David Friedman. I've been very fortunate, and I just feel like sometimes there's a little bit too much focus on personalities within the libertarian movement. We've got some great personalities, but no person is perfect. You know what I mean? I look at someone like Dave Smith, who I really admire him on foreign policy, but I kind of cringe at his immigration views. You know what I mean? So it's not about the person, it's about the principles. And I feel like if we all came together and really went into good faith debates on areas that we disagree. I've got a debate lined up with a minarchist that I'm hoping is going to happen soon. And both of us, I think, are going into that with a lot of good faith. Let me show you why I think you're wrong, and please show me why you think I'm wrong, because I do want to hear it, and you do want to hear it. And I just feel like libertarian and ideas like the Nations of Sanity project, I think, and not just that, but I think I'd love to build like a network of where we're kind of coming together and scrutinizing. We don't all have to agree, but we kind of agree on the kind of rough desire for freedom, and where we disagree on specifics, we can kind of really approach it in a way that we can help each other through debates. We can help each other where we agree, and we can help each other where we disagree. And like I say, this is more of a fuzzy, loose idea in my head at the moment, which is partly why I kind of wanted to speak to you about it, because I thought you could kind of help me. And to be honest, maybe the Herding Cats thing would be a better name for it, because apart from the fact that it's got a bit of humor, it's quite apt, I think, for what I'm trying to do.
Herding Cats is great. don't know how much help I can be, except to say that before the internet, people formed organizations like this to do just what you're talking about, and they'd have conferences, and that would be the purpose. They'd have papers presented and give speeches, and then social things after where everyone can talk. And the point was to get together so you could all speak and focus your time and attention. Now we have the internet and Zoom, which means it's easier than ever to connect, but also it's hard to it's hard to have a conference where the point is to be there and to focus on this thing. So, like, how do you get people to all get together in a certain structured way? You'd have to come up with a structure, I guess, and then try to pitch it. Will you come? Will you come? Will you do this? Is this, are we going to be passing long messages back and forth with a bunch of eyeballs on them where anyone can chime in? I don't know how you would do it.
Yeah.
But if you want it to happen, and of course I do think it's worthy, more communication is better than less. Yay, internet. I mean, look at the gift it's given us to be able to converse like you and I are doing. So yeah, my only advice is to try and emulate what it was that conferences did back in the day in our digital world. And maybe the answer is to just do it in a weekend at Jekyll Island, so to speak.
Well, just to give you, I mean, just to give you an idea of where I was kind of because I have, like I said, I did start a channel Together Strong, and I've got a few videos up there, and like just to give you a rough idea of kind of where I'm coming from. Like one of the videos, for example, was a debate between Stephan Kinsella and Walter Block on voluntary slavery. Like like Walter says that you can enter into slavery contracts. Stephan says you can't. That was a great example of what I was trying to do: bring two people who are both, on the side of liberty, but have this disagreement, and let's work together to get. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to change each other's mind, but I felt like we were able to bring great clarity to that subject. Now, then I had another conversation where I brought Stephan Kinsella on to talk about IP with a guy from Nigeria called Econ Bro, who I don't know if you're familiar with him. I know Bob Murphy's spoken to him, so if you ask Bob about him, he'll know about him.
Yeah.
But he's trying to spread libertarianism in Nigeria, and he prints out like Rothbard books and stuff like that, and distributes them for free, and gives a lot of the economic lessons, talks about inflation, talks about various things. But it was just the reason why I wanted to do it was I just thought, well, I know this great guy here and this great guy here that are doing great work, and there's a way of connecting them.
Maybe my conference idea wasn't the best. Maybe the best model is something like a video collection of debates, Soho Forum style maybe, but not just about any old thing, about disagreements in the theory or something like that. And then you'd have various things in different categories, so it would be easier for people who just stumble across the thing or who are directed to it to easily find what they're interested in and see a couple different discussions.
And it doesn't have to all be disagreements as well. Like I said,
sure.
The example I gave, like the conversation with Stephan and Econ Bro was a conversation. There was no debate. We all agreed on IP, but we were just discussing the details of it. And it was a great source. I mean, it was mainly Stephan that was talking, to be honest, and we were just coming in with questions here and there,
Good point. Maybe we should build it like that.
The other one was a debate, So like I think there's an important, because that's the thing, we don't have to disagree, and where we agree, that's great. And I think we should delve into that, like we did with the IP conversation, and really explore something that we all agree we've got right. And then and then also identify the things that where we disagree on, think each other are wrong on it, and come together to help each other get to the truth. And it's no guarantee, it's the kind of approach of saying, well, look, we can actually work together. We don't have to be enemies, even where we disagree,
Yeah, that might be a great idea. I think you should organize it. I think you should change the name to Herding Cats. And then I think you should pitch yourself as the organizer, moderator, whatever, the person who's hosting the various videos that come, either debate or discussion, and just reach out to people, inviting them to participate. That's kind of a great idea. Way better than that dumb Nations of Sanity thing. Jesus.
I mean, one of the reasons why like one of the things that I like about this idea is I want to then bring the Nations of
Of
Sanity
course.
in
Yeah, of course.
for
Yeah.
scrutiny and say, hey, everybody, what about this idea? I think this is a winner, you know. And that's to say, I mean, I love our conversation that we've had, and I will kind of wrap it up now because I think, you know, we've obviously gone long enough. I hope we'll speak again in the future, though, because it is always a pleasure, and I always come away from it like, you know, with better understanding and a better kind of focus on where I'm going. As I say, I do still think, I suppose I'd leave you and anybody watching this with my kind of parting message with the Nations of Sanity. I do still think, you know, for whatever we need to do about ironing out the details, and I do think what you've spoken about with Stephan's work, I think could be an absolutely invaluable resource for that. But this basic idea, I do still think is something that libertarians should get behind, because apart from the fact that I think it is a unique way to sell it to the normies in a way that we haven't really done before, not in that focused way, but also I do think it is the logical conclusion. I feel like libertarians have started this logical path and then they've stopped short, and there's 2 more steps to go. Make it law, do it through a peace agreement. You know what I mean? It's like that's kind of my message, and my message to you and everybody else listening to this is just think about that, consider that. That's my assertion. Prove me wrong in your own head, or I invite people to obviously tell me, you know, bring arguments in that, because if this isn't the way to go, then obviously let's find the way to go, perhaps through scrutinizing this and seeing where it's wrong and where it could improve. And if it is the way to go, then let's refine it and push forward with it. You know what I mean? Because I do think that our movement becomes stronger when we've got a united message. Like the abolition movement, it still needs a tipping point, but they need that single goal of abolish slavery. And we need that single goal, abolish statism and all that violating coercion. So thank you very much, Adam. I will put links to your work for anybody to check out, and I highly recommend it. I said to you before, I have a lot of long journeys through work, and listening to your show helps shorten those journeys for me a great deal. So you know, thanks. Keep up the good work.
I'm so glad. Thank you. Just in case people don't get to see those show notes or whatever, let me direct people audibly to Haman Nature, Haman nature.com. That's my Substack. And I have a podcast and a YouTube show called Haman Nature. Same thing, Haman. Put it in quotes so you don't get a Michael Jackson video. And please check out my stuff, like, subscribe, do all the things. And this was great, Matthew. I always enjoy our conversations. I will be reposting this conversation on all my stuff as soon as it comes out.
I appreciate it, Adam, and I appreciate you taking the time. Thanks a lot.
Anytime, man.